Hello and welcome to another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, how Joe Ingles, Rob Dillingham, and Terrence Shannon Jr. fit the Timberwolves rotation. What are each of their roles? Comparing it to what those roles looked like in recent past season, what skill sets are they bringing to the Timberwolves? We'll also preview the rest of the offseason for Minnesota. It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. Hopefully, you had a great Independence Day and a happy 4th of July, and hopefully a great Independence Day weekend, if you will. Hopefully a nice 4-day stretch here celebrating the holiday for those of you in the U.S. Today, we're going to talk about the Wolves offseason so far, basically taking a half step back. We talked about each of these moves individually, the biggest ones, of course, being draft night and the addition of Joe Ingles. We'll talk about the roster where it stands, what each of these roles looks like, and dig a bit into some of the numbers, especially on Joe Ingles and the skill set he provides. We talked a little about it Thursday, but I want to get a bit more into why he's such a perfect fit. And you know, if all things are equal, I said this on Thursday, like it's close who I'd rather have on the Wolves, Ingles or Kyle Anderson. But given that Ingles is at the minimum and Anderson would have been, 2-3 times that, plus the penalty of the second apron, they would have paid like $30 million, essentially, like literal money, not just against the cap, but that's what it would have cost the franchise. It's really not close at that cost. Joe Ingles is an awesome addition for Minnesota. So we'll get a bit into that, and then also just kind of talking about what's up next for the offseason. A big thank you off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon at Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. All right. Lots to get to today. Let's start with kind of just a quick reset on what the offseason looks like to date and what Joe Ingles' fit is. We'll get into some of the different roles here as well. So we know that the Timberwolves, in terms of their top 8 rotation guys, top 9 rotation guys, the only one that they were going to lose, that they have lost, is Kyle Anderson. If you go one deeper, you get into the Monte Morris / Jordan McLaughlin role. We know Monte Morris is signed with Phoenix. It's unlikely Jordan McLaughlin's back at this stage. The Wolves just have one roster spot left. So the backup point guard role has been filled now by rookie Rob Dillingham, who the Wolves traded up to number 8 or acquired him at the number 8 pick on draft night last week. And then outside of the rotation, looking in, that next kind of role that early last season was filled by Troy Brown Jr., and there was never really a consistent 10th guy other than multiple point guards. Like at one point it was Morris and McLaughlin. At one point it was TBJ. At another point it was Shake Milton and McLaughlin were seeing minutes. It was kind of all over the place. That role is likely a Terrence Shannon Jr. role. We'll get into that. Kyle Anderson's role was replaced, of course, by Joe Ingles. So that's basically what we're looking at right now. And on my graphic, I've got Joe Ingles first. I actually want to talk about the roles specifically and how they're being kind of I'm going to flip those first 2 bullet points that you see if you're watching on YouTube. I'm going to talk more about the rotation and those roles first, and then we'll get a little bit more in on Joe Ingles. So the easiest way to describe like the Timberwolves in July this year versus 12 months ago in July of last year is it's 7 of the top 8 spots are the same. Rob Dillingham, I think he went by Robert until people just started calling him Rob based on some of the Timberwolves behind the scenes videos that are out there. But Dillingham, he's supposed to be the scoring guard off the bench in the vein of what Shake Milton was supposed to be last year. And think back, you go back and look at some of the quotes that Tim Conley and Chris Finch especially gave last offseason and into training camp about what Shake Milton's role would be. Combo guard, can score, can create for others, can knock down, catch and shoot threes. That never came to fruition with Minnesota. He had like 1 good game, and I'm not exaggerating, maybe 2 in a Timberwolves uniform. He just never found his footing. 2 years ago, that was supposed to be Jaylen Noel. And now 3 years ago, going back to the season that finished with the 6 seed playoff loss to Memphis, in Chris Finch's first full season, Jaylen Noel was really good. And that offseason, Chris Finch talked that all the time about how, like, there was literally one interview where he was talking about the Wolves' young core moving forward, and he mentioned Ant and Kat and Jaden McDaniels, and then he mentioned Jaylen Noel. Like, Jaylen Noel was thought of as like, hey, this is a bargain contract. He's going to be a legit sixth man in the 22-23 season, and he had a horrible year. He just was not good at any point during that season. And sure enough, last year ends up in and out of the NBA with the Grizzlies and then eventually the Kings, and spent a lot of time in the G League. I don't believe he's on a roster currently. And he just never, so they brought in Shake Milton to fill that role, to be somebody who on the bench with the ball in their hands, they're going to score for themselves. They're going to create their own offense, but they can also distribute, run pick and roll. And then the ball comes back to them. They can knock down a catch and shoot three. That's the idea. Shake Milton never was able to do that. Now, Rob Dillingham is a little bit smaller. Not a little bit. He's a lot smaller. I mean, Shake Milton's not huge, and neither is Jaylen Noel. But those guys, I mean, Noel's 6'4". Shake was about that, I believe. And Dillingham is like maybe 6'1", 6'3" wingspan, but he's also like 165 pounds. So he's a lot smaller. He's more of a traditional point guard size, like old school traditional point guard size, which isn't typically Tim Connolly's MO or what Chris Finch is looking for. But if he was, and this came up, I want to say Tyler Metcalf said this a week ago, actually a week ago today, last Friday's show that I did with Tyler Metcalf of No Ceilings NBA. If he was 3-4 inches taller, like, he's the number one pick in the draft. There's no question. He's that talented offensively. The only question marks are really some of the defensive positioning stuff, not even the want to, but some of the knowledge on defense, and then the size, which impacts on both ends, but especially defensively. But offensively, he does everything well besides just be big. Like, that's the only thing he's not good at offensively. And he's going to give you that punch off the bench. He can score for himself. He can create for others. He's a better passer than he was given credit for. Assist rate was good at Kentucky, and it was really more completing the plays that his teammates weren't necessarily completing plays. But one of the things I talked about and Tyler talked about pretty extensively earlier this week and late last week was his reading the defense, how he reads pick and rolls, et cetera. All that to me is next level. It's every bit as good as Shake Milton, who's 4 or 5 years in the league when he came to Minnesota last year, and better than Jaylen Noel ever was at reading defenses. There's no question about that. So he brings you all that, but he's also knockdown catch and shoot. Knockdown catch and shoot. He was 48% last year on 88 attempts for Kentucky on catch and shoot threes. 88 attempts is not a massive sample size, but it's a pretty good one. And he was also 38% off the dribble on threes, which is fantastic. I mean, that's a little better than Anthony Edwards, right in range where Ant was last year. Obviously, 3-point line is different in college. I know that, but he's good off the dribble. He's great catch and shoot. He was 50% shooter out of pick and roll as a ball handler, 43% shooting threes out of pick and roll. We talked already about the feel. So all of those things that the Wolves tried to do with Shake Milton and Jaylen Noel, because you need somebody else with that bench unit. And also I talk about like somebody that can knock down a catch and shoot three. That becomes important when with the substitution pattern, they're on the floor and they're going to share the floor with Anthony Edwards at some point, whether it's at the start of their stint or the end of their stint. And by they, in this case, I'm talking about Dillingham. So they have to also be able to play off the ball. When Dillingham's on the floor, 3/4 of the time, 2/3 of the time, he's going to be the one with the ball in his hands, creating for himself or others. But the rest of the time, you have to be able to be a threat. And Rob Dillingham is that. He's a better version of what they wanted Shake Milton and Jaylen Noel to be. He has to play a minute in the NBA still. I get that. But he should be every bit as good, if it should be better, frankly, offensively, as those guys immediately in the NBA. That was the idea behind Rob Dillingham is he fills that role, and then he's also your backup point guard. And so between him and Nickeil Alexander-Walker and now Joe Ingles, what used to be Kyle Anderson, you've got 3 guys off the bench who can run the offense, and they don't even have a third point guard. And remember, they went into last year without a third point guard too, and I was really surprised by that. And Jordan McLaughlin was in the rotation early in the season, but they played stretches last year, and McLaughlin got hurt again when he wasn't effective before they traded for Monte Morris, and that's one of the reasons why at the trade deadline, backup point guard was like this big thing, and they did end up getting Monte Morris. But they never really had a consistent and consistently effective backup point guard last year at all, and they still managed to be number 1 seed for most of the year, win 56 games, go to the conference finals. And Dillingham is already that. The question is defensively, and we've talked about that, and there's certainly, they got to paper over some of that on the defensive end, and hopefully he ends up being a decent defender as a rookie. We'll see. The exact phrase that Tyler Metcalf used last week was Dillingham is probably going to be a disaster on defense right away, is what he said. I have a little bit more hope than that. I don't want to say faith, a little more hope that he'll be a little better than a disaster this year. But again, number one defense, they could probably paper over some of those deficiencies. All right. I want to talk about the Joe Ingles role and the Terrence Shannon Jr. potential role, and then go a little bit more in depth on Jingles before we get into kind of previewing the rest of the offseason. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Do you watch ESPN or Fox Sports on your TV all day long? If so, no doubt you have to turn down the volume because of all the shouting. Instead, make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, so the Timberwolves rotation right now is going to be obviously same starting lineup: Mike Conley, Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniels, Karl-Anthony Towns, Rudy Gobert. Two of your next three up are going to look really familiar. It's going to be Reid, it's going to be Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and then your eighth man in some order is going to be Rob Dillingham. The next guy in this rotation is Joe Ingles. And we'll talk, I'll do Terrence Shannon next, but Joe Ingles is in that top, probably top 8. I say ninth guy, but like it's going to depend on the night who's actually getting the least minutes off the bench. It's probably Dillingham to start. Ingles is probably kind of your de facto 8th guy, but in terms of your top 9, you're going to have a 9-man rotation at minimum that plays every night in the regular season. Joe Ingles is in that rotation. Him and Dillingham are going to be in that 8th, 9th area. So Dillingham, as we mentioned, takes the Shake Milton / Jalen Noel role from the last 2 seasons, is what I refer to that bench combo scoring guard role. Joe Ingles is in the slow-mo position. And what I mean by that is he's going to play mostly at the 3, which is what Slow-Mo had to do last year. And of course, Slow-Mo was more effective at the 4 2 years ago. Overall in his career, Kyle Anderson is more effective playing the 4 than the 3. Joe Ingles, however, is a little bit more effective playing the 3 than he is the 4, and he's more frequently played the 3 in his career. He's a similar size to Kyle Anderson. I mean, he's 6'9". He's actually maybe a little bit bigger than Kyle Anderson. The length isn't there necessarily. He's never been as good of a defender as Kyle Anderson, although for stretches of his career, Joe Ingles has been better than he's been given credit for. Now, when he was put on an island guarding in Utah's defense because Rudy Gobert was so incredible, and they had Royce O'Neal, a couple other guys that could defend, younger Mike Conley. Ingles was one of the weaker links in a good defense, but he wasn't awful. He's gotten a little bit worse the last couple of years. Like he is 37. He's going to be 37 before opening night in the fall. So he's not great defensively. You're losing a little bit on that end of the floor from Kyle Anderson. But everything on the offensive end, Joe Ingles does just as well or better. And we talked about a lot of this Thursday, so I'm not going to rehash all of it. But the assist rate, 23% last year. Turnover rate was a little high, but overall assisted turnover is palatable for Joe Ingles. 3-point rate, over 70% of his shots last year in each of the last 4 seasons have been threes for his career. Almost exactly 2/3 of his shot attempts have been threes. And again, that's increased as his career has gone on. He's also really good overall in the pick and roll. And Kyle Anderson was fine in the pick and roll, but he was never a threat to score. And to be clear, one of the numbers I rattled off Thursday was, as a pick and roll ball handler, Joe Ingles is a good shooter, but he's not effective at getting into the paint and finishing. Last year, he was like 42% or something in the paint out off a pick and roll. He's not going to beat you off the dribble and score efficiently, at least. The threat for Joe Ingles in the pick and roll is he's such a good passer and such a good shooter that he's going to break down the defense for somebody else. And Kyle Anderson had a little bit of that. But, I mean, go back and watch how anybody defended Kyle Anderson in the half court when he had the ball in his hands. They were giving him 6 feet of space because they knew he wasn't going to shoot the ball until he got to within 12 feet, 15 feet. And even then, it was a 50-50 proposition, which is not bad. A 50%, and 50-50 is actually high. Like, he wasn't that good of a shooter from the elbows or from the nail. But the defense could give him that cushion. You can't necessarily do that with Joe Ingles because he's, I think, a little bit of a better passer than Kyle Anderson. And he's certainly a better perimeter shooter. So there's always the possibility that he just stops and pulls up on a three-pointer, which we'll talk more about his individual, like the types of three-point attempts he was getting up last year and how effective he was. You have to respect him. You can't leave him in the corner. And I want to dive into a little bit of those numbers here. So I talked about his points per possession last year. When he was wide open, he was about 2 points per possession, which meant he was making nearly 2/3 of his wide open three-pointers, which is absolutely bonkers. We talked about the catch and shoot. Last year, Joe Ingles on catch and shoot shots, according to NBA.com stats, he was 53.3% on catch and shoot threes last season. That's insane. 53% on catch and shoot threes. And again, he was like 1.85 or something points per possession on open opportunities, which are mostly threes for Joe Ingles. So he was 60+% on wide open 3-pointers last year. He's going to get a lot of open opportunities. Now, not as many as Kyle Anderson. I know everybody's thinking about all the times Kyle Anderson was open. That was by design from the defense. But some of it was like Anthony Edwards has so much gravity. Rudy Gobert on a roll has so much gravity. Even Naz Reid at this point, Karl-Anthony Towns, these guys all have defenses respecting them. You put Joe Ingles out there, if you're choosing somebody to not guard, it better not be Joe Ingles because he's going to knock down the three nearly 2/3 of the time if he's left wide open. Going into the B-ball index numbers last year for Joe Ingles as a perimeter shooter, he was just a shade under 41% overall in threes. He was 51% catch and shoot threes, according to them. What did I say the NBA.com number was? So these are all very slightly. NBA.com was 53%, according to B-ball index, 51.3% catch and shoot, which is still 98th percentile, an A+ grade. Above the break threes, 39.6%. So 40%, 86th percentile above the break threes. He was 45.5% on corner threes last year, which is 80th percentile in the NBA. We talk about all the Wolves players who should be good at corner threes and aren't as good as they need to be. Go back and look at what he did in Utah on corner threes. I'm just go through his career on corner threes. 45%, 49%, 42%, 53% one season on corner threes, 44%. His down year, he was 37%, 51% catch and shoot threes, 40%, 45%. Last year, 47% in Orlando on corner threes. You leave him wide open, that number's north of 50%. So take Kyle Anderson out of this. Think about that being Joe Ingles in the corner. Again, he's not going to be left as wide open, but what does that mean? That means more of a driving lane for Anthony Edwards, more space to operate for Rob Dillingham, for Karl-Anthony Towns attacking from the perimeter, for Rudy to roll. And Rudy's such a good, what did Rudy do in Utah? It was short roll, kick to the corner to Joe Ingles, to Royce O'Neal, to Mike Conley, to Donovan Mitchell. Rudy's a really good short roll passer. And it wasn't as effective when it was Kyle Anderson and to a lesser extent, Jaden McDaniels. Jaden had it down in shooting year 2. We'll talk more about that this offseason. That's another thing that has to work in the other direction for Minnesota. Jaden he may not be 40% every year like he was 2 years ago, but he's got to be better than 33 or whatever he shot last year. If that's league average and it's pick your poison, so it's Ant attacking, say it's Ant and Rudy. You got Joe Ingles in one quarter. He's going to shoot over 50% open on threes. Jaden McDaniels, who hopefully is around 40% wide open quarter threes. Or you allow Ant and Rudy to attack the middle of your defense, and whoever is your other guy, is it Naz, is it Karl-Anthony Towns, whoever it is, they can attack a closeout, and go score in the lane. It adds a dimension that this offense did not have, and it's why I say, even like if it was the same dollar amount, I could have made the argument for Joe Ingles being a better fit. There's always the chance that like he's 37 he may just completely be ineffective at this stage of his career. Like, but he was really good last year. So it's like, I mean, it's like if you're a Twins fan, it's like Nelson Cruz. Like, you're just kind of like, is it this year that his career falls apart, or is it next year? Like, let's give him a minimum contract and find out. So like, he made $11 million last year, and he's going to make the vet minimum this year with Minnesota. And I bet he could have made more with a non-contender. But Minnesota, he wanted to win, and he's a perfect fit. He's Kyle Anderson offensively with a jumper, and I think a little bit of a better passer. And yeah, you're going to give something back on defense. And it's, but like, think about Utah. Utah didn't have any outstanding perimeter defenders. They just had Rudy, a couple of good perimeter defenders, and some really bad ones. This Minnesota team now has Rudy, and they've got 2 or 3 of the best perimeter defenders in the entire NBA. Jaden McDaniels, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and a locked-in Anthony Edwards are like 3 of the top, we'll call it 15. If there was an all-defensive third team, Anthony Nickeil Alexander-Walker would have had a shot of making it. 3 of the best perimeter defenders in the league. You got a passable guy who's long in the tooth and just a good team defender in Mike Conley, and then a couple guys who aren't going to be as good, and Rob Dillingham, Joe Ingles. But average that all out, plus Rudy, plus Cat, plus Nas, who all have size and length. This is not going to be, the defense may not be as good this year as it was last year, but it may still be the league's best defense. It's certainly still a better combination than what Utah was trying out there with Rudy. So I love the Joe Ingles addition. I love him in the Kyle Anderson role. I just think that alone, remember, this is an offense that finished like 18th last year in the league. They have no business being 18th in the league with Anthony Edwards and Karl-Anthony Towns, and the gravity of a Rudy Gobert and the third best 3-point shooting team in the league. Just having Joe Ingles on the floor is going to raise. Remember, they didn't shoot enough threes. They were bottom third of the league-ish, bottom half of the league in terms of 3-point attempt rate. Just having Joe Ingles is going to raise that, because Kyle Anderson's 0.6 threes a game becomes Joe Ingles. What's he going to shoot? Like last year with Orlando, I guess he only played 17 minutes. So it was 2.5 threes a game. But the year before with Milwaukee, 4.5 threes a game. The year before with Utah, 5 threes a game. So call it 3.5 to 4 threes per game. That's 3 more 3-point attempts per game at a 40% plus clip. And that's going to make a huge difference. I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but it is. And then factor in the essentially the gravity of Joe Ingles in the corner. Because if you don't guard him, he's going to make the 3 over half the time. If you do guard him, more space for Ant, for Dillingham, for Cat, for whoever's attacking in the middle of the floor. It's awesome. It's going to be a really, really nice fit. Let's talk next about Terrence Shannon Jr., what his role might be with this team. Is he going to see minutes early? What does that look like? And then we'll talk about what's upcoming here the next few weeks this offseason. We'll do all that here next. All right. So the Timberwolves, even though they acquired the number 8 pick in the draft and took Dillingham, they kept the 27 pick last week in the first round of the draft. It took Terrence Shannon Jr. out of Illinois. Go back and listen to Monday's show. I talked to Tyler Metcalf of No Ceilings NBA to talk about Shannon, what he brings to the table. And actually, I'm working on a conversation with Locked On Illini with their host, Sonny, talking about Terrence Shannon. We're going to talk about his role with Minnesota. We're going to also talk about what he did in college. So that'll probably be early next week that we'll run that. And so I'm not going to go through the whole scouting report on Terrence Shannon Jr., but the short version is, dude was a 20-point per game scorer at Illinois. A lot of it, not all of it, a lot of it was transition. It was just being quicker, more athletic, and also just a volume 3-point shooter, like a really solid 3-point shooter. He had a lot of volume at Illinois. And some of that was created in the half court. He was pretty good off the dribble. But the volume of opportunities will not be there in the NBA. They're going to ask him to be the lower usage. I shouldn't say lower usage. He'll be a high usage guy when he's on the floor, but he's not going to be the microwave, right? That's Rob Dillingham's job, to be the sixth man, the Jamal Crawford, if you will, scorer. Terrence Shannon is going to be the 10th man. He's going to be in what effectively was, I'm trying to create these comparisons to last year's opening night roster. The TBJ, the Troy Brown Jr. role, energy, hopefully some defense, knock down threes in the open floor, dunk on people in transition. He might not always play early in the season. Some of the time he might get 10 minutes. Some of the time he might get 2 minutes. Some of the time he might not play. If there's foul trouble with Jaden McDaniels, maybe he plays more. He plays 16, 18 minutes. That's possible. It's going to be a wide variance of how often Shannon plays in the fall, at least at the start of the season. He's going to get plenty of run in Summer League, and he'll be higher usage in Summer League. He's going to get plenty of run in training camp and early and preseason. But I think he's the 10th guy. And I think he's the first guy to benefit if there's issues, foul trouble issues with especially Jaden, but to a lesser extent, Nah or Anthony Edwards. I think he's going to be the next man up. I do think he's going to get the inside track on the 10th man spot because of the combination of the 3-and-D stuff and how good he is in transition. He can obviously handle the ball. He did it a ton at Illinois. So that's his role. It's energy, it's threes, it's dunks, it's transition, it's defense. He's going to battle a little bit with Josh Minott, I think, for that role. And depending on what the Wolves need on any given night, it could go back and forth. And I'm a huge Josh Minott fan. I've been on record for years. Like, I did a whole show last summer, I think, on or most of a show on basically his rate-based stats in college and the G League and just how impressive they are in relatively small samples. And if he had the opportunity to play more, what could he turn into? Is he a different version of, say, Brandon Clark from Memphis, right? Like, that's the type of player I think he is. The problem is he doesn't shoot threes well enough to be in that role. And with how Chris Finch wants to play, I think Terrence Shannon, I think the rookie has the inside track on that 10th man role. If it's a bigger opponent, if it's a game that's going to require more rebounding, if there's bigger wings that require that the Wolves need to guard on the perimeter, Josh Minott might have that opportunity over Terrence Shannon Jr. And I'm curious to see how Minott looks in Summer League. He had moments last summer. He had one 20-plus point game, if I'm not mistaken, in Vegas last summer. There's still upside there. The question is the handle, the 3-point shooting. In my mind, he's a low usage, wreak havoc on defense, wreak havoc in transition, start breaks the other way, offensive rebounds, dunks, lobs, opportunities from the dunker spot, stuff like that. I think he's a small ball 4. Josh Minott is. I don't think he's a 3 that can guard 2s like Terrence Shannon is. So I think Minott is going to be on the outside looking in, but have every opportunity. If there's an injury, God forbid, if there's foul trouble, if there's, say Shannon really struggles early on, Minott's got a shot. And I'm excited to see him play, Summer League, but especially preseason, early in the season. I'd like to see him get an opportunity. To a lesser extent, Leonard Miller, he's, of course, a year behind Minott in terms of experience. He's also more of a really a point big, if you will. Better handle than Josh Minott, better passer than Josh Minott, better scorer than Josh Minott. But the question is the defensive consistency there for Miller? I don't think it's going to be as good, at least not now, as Minott. And he's not going to give you as much on the glass. He could be a very good rebounder, and he has been for stretches. But I think Minott has a chance to be better, at least on the offensive glass, than Leonard Miller. So either one of those guys has a chance. But I honestly think Shannon's got the inside track on that 10th man role. It's going to depend on what the situation calls for. So it is a little bit of how, Denver last year tried to fill like 3 bench roles with rookies and second year or third year guys, not with proven veterans. The addition of Ingles and the fact they still have Alexander Walker and, of course, Naz Reid means we're talking the 9th and 10th roles for Dillingham. And then this kind of battling out between the late first rounder, second rounders from past years like Leonard Miller and Josh Minott. That's fine. Because of the 3 of those, you're going to find somebody that's going to play well in a 10th man role. You get to the playoffs, they don't even need to play anyway. So as long as Dillingham's decent, your rotation's in a pretty good spot. So a lot to like there with what the Wolves have. And that doesn't even include Jalen Clark. We'll spend more time on him later this offseason. I'll probably, we'll see what he looks like in Summer League. I'm excited to see him play. We have not seen him play. He hasn't played in a game in a year and a half almost, not quite a year and a half, 14, 15 months before he tore his Achilles at UCLA. It was last March. Excited to see him in Summer League. He's got a real shot at being a rotation guy. And I think he'll be on the outside looking in for most of the year, but they're clearly looking at Nickeil Alexander-Walker is only making $4 million this year. They're not gonna be able to afford him a year from now in free agency. He's going to be gone. They got a steal, and he was awesome last year. Jalen Clark's going to have to be able to play that role, and we'll talk about that another day. But that's Jalen Clark's going to be 11th, 12th, 13th guy. Probably, we'll get a chance in the G League. He's on a 2-way deal this year to play a lot in the G League, play his way into some shape, show a little bit of something offensively, and he's got a real shot. All right, real quick. Next up, Summer League. The Wolves actually play a week from today. Next Friday, they play a Summer League game at 4 p.m. Central against the Pelicans on ESPN2. We don't have the Summer League roster yet. We'll talk about that early next week as they go to Summer League training camp or whatever they call it, Summer League camp. We know that a bunch of rookies are going to play. We know Minott's going to – a bunch of rookies. Shannon and and Dillingham, and I would imagine, they did say that Clark's going to play, Miller, Minot, all those guys are going to be there. But who else on the roster? That'll be fun. We'll talk about that next week. So a week from now, we've got Summer League action we'll be able to talk about here on the show. And then, of course, we know Olympic basketball. The basketball competition starts on July 27th. So what is that, like basically 3 weeks away? So we're still daily throughout the month of July. And then in August, we'll still be 3 times a week. So we'll be talking NBA Olympic basketball. Of course, Anthony Edwards on Team USA. Lots of other Wolves players involved. Nikhil Alexander-Walker, Rudy Gobert, Joe Ingles playing for Australia. Like, there's lots of guys that are out there on the Wolves roster playing in Olympic action. So we'll talk about how they're all doing, and of course have a special focus on Ant and Team USA as we get into August. So a packed summer here on Locked On Wolves. And believe it or not, once the Olympics are over, I mean, then we're like, what, 3-4 weeks away from like media day, probably a month away from training camp. So it all happens very quickly when you play into June, as the Wolves did this year. So lots to get to here in the coming weeks. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms.